So in this segment, we're going to be talking about the UK exploring a fourth delay to imposing checks on EU imports. So this is comical because all this talk about take back control and all this nonsense when we don't even know what we're doing. The EU has been preparing for this since 2016, and it was far easier for the EU to prepare for this because they have so many points of entry. Dover Calais, the Calais crossing being the predominant one, but they still got like Rotterdam and other places. Whilst for the UK, we never had the infrastructure built up to do this. To the point where imports were going from Felixstowe to be processed in Rotterdam, because that's how much more prepared. Because that's how much more prepared the EU were compared to the UK, which it's not a high bar, but they've done far better than us. Let's be real here. So Downing Street is exploring yet another delay to post-Brexit border checks on goods entering Britain from the EU to prevent what industry has warned would be a supply chain disaster, because full import checks haven't gone in yet. There are things like standards. It mentions it in the article, to be fair, in green. So we'll go off the article and do some more analysis. So ministers are considering whether to push back for the fourth time the introduction of full checks on imports from the EU. And let's not forget that Michael Gove said we'd need to have 50,000 customs officers in order to do all the checks, and that's simply not going to happen, which we were supposed to come into effect on July 1st of last year as part of the drive to tackle trade friction and the crisis in the cost of living. Officials briefed on discussions said. Mr. Mogg, Brexit opportunities minister, argued, actually I think that's July 1st of this year. No, it's July 1st of this year, that's my bad. Which is they've still got a decent amount of time. Mr. Mogg, the Brexit opportunities minister, argued at a private meeting last week that one advantage of leaving the EU would be to allow Britain to apply only loose checks on imports. But, whilst we were a member of the EU, we didn't have to do any checks on EU imports. I guess he's talking about the rest of the world imports where, especially when you're importing goods from countries of lower standards, it's not always a good idea. Goods arriving from the EU are not subject to safety and security declaration. So, like we take the CE mark basically as credit, or as kind of goods are fine, which makes sense because the CE mark is very good in terms of global trade. Even the Americans, I think, accept it. But so we don't check for these safety and security declarations or anything. While food and plant products are not physically checked, so they don't actually physically check what's in the boxes or whatever else that comes to the UK via the EU or from the EU. None of that stuff is checked. So say for example, if someone's like, oh yeah, I've got these car parts here that were definitely manufactured in the EU and weren't manufactured in China, so we don't have to pay tariffs, they can get away with that sort of stuff. Smuggling, essentially. Senior figures in number 10 are sympathetic to the idea of further delays beyond July for the new checks, according to the officials. And I do wonder, when are we actually going to do these checks? Because if you think about it now, the year's 2022, got an election in 3 years. The moment we do these checks is the moment that things get a lot worse for us. There'll be a lot more shortages on shelves and things like that. When are we actually going to do these checks? Probably never, to be honest, unless we get sued by a WTO member. Senior figures in number 10 sympathetic. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has not yet made a firm decision but is being urged to extend the grace period for EU imports by Mogg and former Brexit Minister Lord Frost. Frost has put some stuff on Twitter which we'll get to eventually, might be a while. Ministers are looking at this in the light of cost of living pressures, which the government has done very little to alleviate the cost of living crisis, and supply chain pressures, which again the government has done very little to solve as well. The war in Ukraine has also changed the economic context, not by a ton though. They keep talking about the war in Ukraine, but we kicked the physical checks into the long grass way before the war in Ukraine, or should I say the Russian invasion of Ukraine. British exports to the EU have been subjected to the full panoply of EU border checks. So the word panoply, which is a weird one, means extensive or impressive collection or a splendid display. So we've been hit with the full shebang really from the start of EU border checks, which as a third country we should be hit with, let's be honest, since the first day of Brexit in January 2020, while imports from European competitors have enjoyed a far smoother entry into the UK because we delayed the checks by a year, the actual start of the import checks, and so that would have been actually was it delayed? So start of January 2020, was that not last year? I'm losing track of time. Checks were first delayed in June 2020, followed by further deadline extensions in March 2021, and again in September 2021. When the EU, if the EU have been doing this for, we delayed it by 2 years. Then the actual start of checks, which is crazy if my perception of time is correct, or if this article is correct, because the first day of Brexit 2020, while imports from European competitors have enjoyed a far smoother entry into the UK, Shane Brennan, chief executive of the Cold Chain Federation, said imposing full veterinary controls on food imports from the EU would lead to a collapse in supplies for UK businesses that relied on frequent deliveries of small volumes of fresh food products from the EU, and these products don't last long. Some of this stuff will be like yogurts and other things, and it's simply the case, especially with like artisan products, things that are more expensive and more niche, they don't have a long shelf life. There are other issues when it comes to importing the goods. Customers can have requests, and companies can say go to like a specialist producer in the UK and ask for certain products, and before Brexit they would come in fairly quickly within a couple of days. But with this kind of process now, it could take weeks to come in, and these products don't have a long shelf life. Given the ongoing inflationary crisis and supply chain stress, a further delay makes sense, even if it entrenches the ongoing unfairness between the experience of EU importers and UK exporters. He said, well, the simple fact is, EU exporters are having a much easier time than UK exporters because of the British government. James Withers, if the UK wanted to, if we had the facilities, we could level out the playing field and say, fine, we don't have an agreement in place, we're out of the single market, we're a third country, then we can do full import checks on the EU if we had the facilities to do that, which we don't. James Withers, chief executive of Scotland's Food and Drink, said any decision to delay would anger many exporters, which I'm sure the Tory government would say cry more. There is a logic given the ripples in the supply chain crisis created by the Ukraine crisis, which again, the war in Ukraine's been going on since I think just February. So the UK delayed the decision to do physical inspections into July last year, I believe. So blaming it on Ukraine makes no sense. It's a government talking point. But there's no doubt this will stick in the throat of many exporters who are now 15 months into navigating a tsunami of paperwork that our EU competitors are not facing, he said. And again, I'll ask you who you're mad at, because it's the Tory government that have done this. There were people under the impression that once we start doing full import checks, the EU might lower their import checks, essentially their rules for bringing in goods from the UK, because it's going to damage both sides. Again, this is a double-edged sword, but it's damaging the UK far more than it is the EU, because the EU countries have 26 other member states to import from. The UK does not have that luxury. And we've covered articles previously where EU member states are replacing UK exports, essentially. So, say, for example, if, there's a really famous example, or it's not that famous, it's a nerd example, of, pork exports going to Germany from the UK being stopped because of all the SPS checks and everything else. So what did the Germans do? The manufacturer do? They imported it from Denmark. So that's what's simply going to happen. They have so many more options than us. However, the Food and Drinks Federation, the UK's main trade body for food processors, said while full controls were important in the long term, the crisis in Ukraine, which I can see why they're using government talking points, so it doesn't, upset the government too much, but it's simply the case that you can't blame Ukraine on this, which is particularly hurting supplies of wheat, sunflower oil, and whitefish. Justified delay. These are things which we typically go into other, not just as raw products you can sell on the market, but also into other products, which makes sense. Because we're facing shortages of this because of the Russian invasion. But these things, do they really necessitate a delay, a further delay? Especially when I think the UK is actually quite big in wheat, growing wheat. I'm not sure about sunflowers. I think whitefish we do okay on, so it doesn't make sense he's using this argument, or the Food and Drink Federation are using this argument. Britain's trade performance has recovered from the pandemic much more slowly than equivalent developed economies, which doesn't surprise anyone considering that trade was artificially lowered because of the pandemic. Less people buying certain things. So once the pandemic effects kind of fade, countries can do better, whilst the UK's trade was hit by the pandemic, but also from Brexit, which the Office of Budget and Responsibility have said our imports and exports are going to be 15% lower than if the UK had remained a member state, which is a significant drop off for imports and exports, and that will never come back because of the complexities of doing these checks. So the OBR, the independent fiscal watchdog, which apparently Rishi Sunak is not a big fan of, which doesn't surprise me. Last week held this assumption that leaving the EU will result in the UK's total imports and exports being 15% lower than had the UK remained a member state, which is a lot of lost money for the UK. One person close to Rees-Mogg said the self-imposed costs were out of proportion with the risks on the ground, which, no, there's a reason why you have these checks, to make sure the things coming in are, the things that the paperwork say they are. So otherwise you lose out on things like, customs and VAT fees. And also the fact that you have to make sure these products are safe and secure. At a time of high and rising inflation and supply chain difficulties, we should not introduce burdensome checks that will impose costs on ourselves, on businesses and consumers. Well, Mr. Mogg, we shouldn't have done Brexit then, because that's exactly what Brexit has done. His position is echoed by Frost, who said last month, we have to put up with EU controls, but we should have a light touch border to the whole world. That's a Brexit opportunity, which we have the opportunity to do. But again, you run the risk of importing lower standard goods from other countries that have lower standards than us, Australia being the predominant one, because we have a newly minted trade deal with them. Mogg has urged fellow ministers to wait. Mogg is a minister, has urged fellow ministers to wait the conclusions of government plans to digitise border processes to create the most effective border in the world, which, again, world beating all this nonsense by 2025, which he has now responsibility for. The problem is one that after the general election, so Mogg will never be held accountable for this, because he's definitely not putting the infrastructure in now. The other problem is the chief system is rubbish from what I've read, and the further problem is that because we want to use our own IT system and not an EU IT system, we can't actually use a lot of digitized paperwork. So if we use the EU's IT system, we could have things like digital signatures for vets, but because we're using our own one, it requires wet signatures, which is apparently causing a problem. But other people have said that's also a red herring. But having digital paperwork is a lot easier than having all the physical documents. But yeah, the simple fact is this idea of having the best borders by 2025 is simply not going to happen. But the UK exploring a further delay to doing physical checks on EU imports is just embarrassing. All this talk about take back control and all this other nonsense, it doesn't work. And I think the biggest issue is that, again, I'm not a legal expert in this regard, but from what I've read and heard about most favourable nations, treating other people equally under the WTO agreements, countries cannot discriminate between their trading partners, grant someone a special favour such as a lower customs duty rate for one of their products, and you have to do the same for other WTO members. That would also, I think, cover things like import checks and other things. We're not doing the EU a favour per se, we're doing ourselves a favour, but we are treating EU imports differently, or EU exports differently to the rest of the world exports, because on other products, say from America or Canada, we would be checking for security and other sorts of paperwork, whilst from the EU it doesn't look like we are going to do that anytime soon. So it does open the door to be sued by WTO members, but the only country, ironically, that has sued or is looking at taking the UK to court, to the WTO court, is the EU, which is hilarious. But we'll get there when we get there. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.